told her she was nothing. Wolfless, packless, a stain on the bloodline that should have been scrubbed away years ago. So when the Alpha King demanded a bride from every territory, her stepfather saw the perfect opportunity. Send the one no one would miss. The one who scrubbed floors and ate scraps and slept in rooms without fire. Send Ember Ashwell. Kieran Blackthorne, the giant Alpha King, never wanted a wife. He wanted a treaty. Political stability wrapped in ceremonial silk. But when the trembling bride climbed the altar stairs and the veil dropped from her face, revealing silver white eyes and a crescent scar he'd seen in every dream since boyhood, the king who had never kneeled felt his knees buckle. She wasn't a sacrifice. She was his mate, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. The morning they came for her, Ember was elbow-deep in lye soap and pig fat scrubbing the stone kitchen floors of Ashwell Keep. The Montana winter had crept through the walls overnight, turning the water in her bucket to a skin of ice that cracked when she pushed her rag through it. Her hands were raw. They were always raw. She heard the boots first, iron-shod, deliberate, the unhurried cadence of men who had never once been made to wait. Then the door groaned on its hinges and sunlight cut across the wet stone like a blade. 3 soldiers stood in the doorway. Black leather polished to a mirror shine, despite the 2-day ride through mountain passes. The crest of the high alpha throne stitched in silver thread on every chest. A wolf's head, jaws open, surrounded by a crescent moon. Ember didn't raise her head. She'd learned in 19 years under Thorn Ashwell's roof that looking up too quickly was an invitation for someone to push you back down. Lord Ashwell, the tallest soldier said. His voice filled the corridor like smoke fills a closed room. The king requires your response. 1 daughter. By the full moon. Thorn stood in the doorway behind them. Ember could smell his particular brand of cruelty before she saw him. Pipe smoke and old meat. A sourness that clung to his collar and followed him through every room of the keep. He hadn't looked at her directly in 12 years. Not since her mother died and the wolf in Ember's blood failed to manifest at her first moon ceremony. Wolfless. The word had become her name in this house long before it became a sentence. I have 1 daughter suitable for the arrangement, Thorn said. The smile in his voice was audible, sharp as a skinning knife. She's right there. The soldiers turned. So did the world. Ember's hands stilled in the bucket of gray water. A tendril of dark hair fell across the crescent-shaped scar below her left eye. A scar she'd carried since birth, pale and luminous as a sliver of moon against her skin. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew what Thorn was doing. Everyone in the keep knew. He wasn't offering a bride. He was disposing of evidence. For 19 years, Ember had survived on stillness, on the art of folding herself so small that even a house full of lichens forgot she breathed. She ate the scraps after the pack was fed. She slept in a room where the winter wind came through gaps in the stone and frost formed on the blanket by morning. She wore the same 3 dresses patched and laundered and patched again until the original fabric was more memory than material. And she carried always a single object, a tarnished silver locket on a thin chain around her neck. Inside it, pressed between 2 circles of glass, was a moon petal flower. Papery and white translucent at the edges, so fragile it seemed like it might crumble if you breathed on it wrong. But it hadn't crumbled. Not in 19 years. Her mother, Lyanna, had plucked it the night before she died. Placed it in infant Ember's hand with fingers already cold, already fading. The locket was the only proof Ember had that someone once had loved her enough to leave something behind. She has no wolf, one of the soldiers said. His voice was flat, clinical. The way you might note that a horse had gone lame or a crop had failed. The king's bride must be the decree, Thorn interrupted. Stepping closer, his bulk filling the doorframe, says 1 daughter. It does not specify what she must be, only that she must come willingly. He let that last word hang in the air like a noose. Ember felt the room tighten around her, felt the weight of 3 soldiers' stares and Thorn's presence behind them, a heat more dangerous than any fire. She understood the calculus instantly. If she said no, the soldiers would leave. They had to. The treaty required willing brides, not captives. But Thorn would make sure she didn't survive the night. He'd been looking for a final excuse for years. This was it, wrapped in silk and law. Girl, the tall soldier said, not unkindly but not gently either. Do you go willingly? The question was a formality. She could hear it in his tone. He didn't care about her answer. He cared about fulfilling the king's order and getting back on the road before the next snowfall closed the mountain passes. Ember wrung the rag in her hands. Water dripped between her knuckles like tears she'd stopped shedding years ago. Yes, she whispered. The word tasted like ash. They gave her 10 minutes to gather her things. It took less than 2. one change of clothes folded and placed in a canvas sack that had once held grain. A pair of boots with soles worn so thin she could feel every stone through the leather, and the locket which she unclasped from around her throat and held in her palm for a long moment before putting it back on. She pressed her thumb against the silver casing, felt the outline of the moon petal inside preserved under glass like a secret. Her mother had told her once in the fever dreams before death took her that the moon didn't argue with the darkness. It just kept shining until the dark forgot it was ever there. Ember had been 7 years old and hadn't understood. Now standing in the cold room with frost on the window and her entire life packed into a sack that weighed less than 5 pounds, she thought maybe she did. She didn't look back at Ashwell Keep as the carriage pulled away. There was nothing to look back at. The stone walls had never been a home, only a cage with a kitchen. The road wound north through black pines and granite cliffs, climbing higher into the Montana mountains with every mile. The temperature dropped. Ember watched through the frosted carriage window as the landscape turned from brown winter grass to snow-covered slopes, from scattered homesteads to wilderness so thick and dark it felt like the forest might swallow the road entirely. The soldiers didn't speak to her. She was cargo, precious enough to protect, not valuable enough to acknowledge. On the second day, the forest opened up and Iron Haven came into view. Ember's breath caught. The fortress rose from the mountain like a fist punched through the earth. Black stone, iron ramparts, towers that clawed at the sky with pointed peaks that seemed designed to tear clouds apart. Banners of deep crimson and charcoal snapped in the wind, each one bearing the wolf head crest. The air here smelled different. Forged smoke and pine resin and something else. Something concentrated and animal. The musk of thousands of wolves living shoulder to shoulder inside ancient walls. 5,400 lichens, Ember would learn later. Military and civilian. The largest pack in North America, all answering to one man. The carriage entered through the eastern gate just after dawn on the third day. Ember pressed her face to the window and watched the courtyard unfold. Soldiers drilling with weighted swords, their breath coming out in clouds. Servants hauling grain in wooden carts. A massive gray wolf shoulder height with a grown man's hip trotting alongside a woman, carrying a basket of bread as casually as a dog might follow its owner. Except this was no dog. The wolf's eyes shone with unmistakable intelligence. Its ears swiveled independently, tracking sounds Ember couldn't hear. When it looked directly at the carriage, Ember felt the weight of its attention like a hand pressed against her sternum. Her chest ached. She had never shifted, had never felt the bone-deep pull of a wolf trying to surface the instinct that every other lichen described as natural as breathing. Every wolf around her existed in 2 bodies. She was trapped in one, and it was the wrong one. They brought her through a servant's quarter. Deliberately, she suspected so fewer eyes would see the king's bride before the ceremony. A woman named Marin, gray-haired and brisk, was assigned to prepare her. Marin took one look at Ember's threadbare dress, the bruise on her wrist where Thorn's grip had lingered 3 days later, the thinness of her frame, and said nothing. But her hands were gentle as she guided Ember into a bath that smelled of juniper and chamomile. The water was hot, actually hot. Ember couldn't remember the last time she'd bathed in water that didn't have a skim of ice on top. The ceremony's at moonrise, Marin said, laying out a white gown on the bench. The fabric looked like it had been made for someone twice Ember's size, all flowing silk and intricate lacework. The veil stays on until the king lifts it. That's tradition. You stand, you kneel when told, and you don't speak unless spoken to, understood. I understand, Ember said quietly. Marin paused, studying her with eyes that had seen decades of brides come through these halls. Most of them noble daughters in elaborate gowns trailing servants and demands. You're not what they usually send, Marin said finally. No, good. Marin's mouth twitched, almost a smile. The usual ones are worse. The gown was adjusted with pins and hurried stitches, taken in at the waist and shoulders until it fit Ember's slight frame. The veil was heavy, ivory silk edged with silver thread falling past her chin and obscuring everything but the vaguest outline of her features. Beneath it, Ember touched the locket at her throat. Pressed the cool metal against her sternum. The moon petal inside was her mother's last gift. It meant, I see you. You are real. You matter. She held on to that meaning now because everything else was slipping. The throne room was cavernous. Stone pillars thick as ancient trees supported a vaulted ceiling, lost in shadow. Torchlight threw unsteady patterns across the floor, orange and gold, making the darkness beyond seem to pulse and breathe. Every seat was filled. Alpha lords in formal leather, Luna consorts in silken furs, territory delegates, military commanders, 200 witnesses, maybe 3, then all watching the center aisle with the particular focus of wolves observing fresh prey. And at the far end, on a throne carved from a single slab of black basalt, sat Kieran Blackthorn. Ember felt him before she saw him clearly. It was like walking into a wall of atmosphere, a gravitational pull that pressed against her skin and made her eardrums hum. Alpha presence. She'd felt it before from Thorn, from visiting lords who came to Ashwell Keep with their chests puffed and their wolves barely contained. But this was different. This was a continent of power compressed into the shape of a man radiating outward in waves that made the torches flicker. He was enormous. That was the first coherent thought Ember managed as she walked down the aisle, her two large shoes whispering against stone. And his eyes, gold, lupine. Even in human form, they carried the weight of the wolf beneath. They swept the room with the casual authority of someone who had never in his entire life encountered a locked door he couldn't break through. He looked bored, irritated even. His massive hands gripped the armrests of the throne and one thumb tapped an impatient rhythm against the stone. The sound carried in the silence. A drum beat, a countdown. Ember was led down the aisle by two attendants in ceremonial robes. She concentrated on not tripping, on keeping her breathing steady beneath the heavy veil. The room was silent except for the crackle of torches and the soft pad of her feet. She reached the altar stairs, climbed them, stood before the Alpha King, close enough now to see the network of pale scars across his knuckles, 40 maybe more layered on top of each other like a topographical map of violence. Close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way the muscle jumped beneath the armor. Close enough to hear his breath slow and controlled and to watch his nostrils flare once as he scented her. His brow furrowed. The high priest began the words, old words in the old language that most Lycans had forgotten but still recognized in their bones. Words about pack and bond and blood. Ember heard none of them. Blood roared in her ears. She was shaking beneath the gown, her hands clenched so tightly, her nails bit into her palms, and she was praying to a god she wasn't sure existed, that no one could see the trembling through the heavy silk. Then the priest nodded, and Kieran Blackthorn rose from his throne. He was taller standing, impossibly tall. His shadow swallowed hers completely, a dark shape that seemed to blot out the torchlight and the watching crowd and everything except the space between them. He reached forward with hands that could have crushed stone, gripped the edge of the veil, and lifted. The silk fell away like water. Ember looked up into the face of the giant Alpha King, and the king looked down into hers. His gold eyes locked onto the crescent scar beneath her left eye, his pupils dilated, blown wide, swallowing the gold until only a thin ring remained. His breath stopped, visibly, completely, as if the air itself had been yanked from his chest by an invisible hand. The impatient thumb went still. The bored expression shattered. Something ancient and involuntary moved across his face. Not recognition exactly. Something deeper, older, a collision of instinct and memory that had no name in any human language. His knees buckled. The giant Alpha King who had conquered 3 territories before his 20th year, who had held his dying father's body and not shed a single tear, who had never bowed to any living creature, sank to his knees on the altar stone with a sound like a building falling. The impact cracked the step clean across the middle. The throne room erupted into chaos. Kieran's knees hit the stone and the altar fractured beneath him. The crack ran from the center point outward in jagged lines, splitting the ancient granite like lightning through a dark sky. The sound rang through the throne room. Sharp, final, a gunshot in a cathedral. Every Lycan in attendance felt it. Not just the physical fracture of stone, but the spiritual earthquake beneath it. An Alpha King kneeling, unprompted, unforced. Kneeling before a slip of a girl in a too large gown with a scar on her face and no detectable wolf signature whatsoever. Advisors surged forward. General Ronan Graves, the king's oldest military commander, was the first to reach the dais. His hand was already on his sword hilt, eyes scanning for threats that didn't exist. My king, out. Kieran's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of an alpha command. The word pressed against every skull in the room like a palm against wet clay. Not painful, but impossible to ignore. Ronan froze mid-step, the attendants froze. Even the torches seemed to hold their breath. Kieran's gold eyes had not left Ember's face. She stood above him. The only time in her life she would ever look down at a king, and she could not understand what she was seeing. His expression was fractured, as if someone had taken the mask of authority he wore and dropped it from a great height. Beneath the shards was something raw, something almost agonized. Your scar, he breathed. His hand rose. Slowly. The motion of a man approaching something sacred or explosive. His fingertips hovered a hair's breadth from the crescent mark below her eye. He did not touch her. "I've seen this," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "Every night since I was 12 years old." Ember's throat closed. She didn't understand. Fated mate bonds were the stuff of old songs and older superstition. They didn't happen to real people. And they certainly didn't happen to wolfless girls who scrubbed floors in border keeps and carried their entire lives in a canvas sack. But the king was still kneeling. The throne room hadn't emptied. Nobody was willing to miss this. Whispers raced through the gallery like fire through dry grass. Ember caught fragments. "Wolfless? Impossible. Mistake." She heard the word insult twice spat like poison. Kieran rose. The motion was abrupt, almost violent, as if he was furious at his own body for betraying him. He straightened to his full height, and the 2 feet of difference between them became a canyon. His jaw tightened, his gold eyes flickered, and Ember watched in real time as the vulnerability she glimpsed for 3 seconds sealed itself behind stone. This was a mistake. Not hers. His. "The ceremony will conclude," Kieran said to the priest. His voice was rigidly controlled now, each word placed with the precision of a man building a wall. "As agreed, this changes nothing." But his hands were shaking. The remaining rites were completed in brittle silence. Ember repeated the words she was told to repeat. "I accept this bond. I honor this pact. I serve this throne." The words felt like stones in her mouth. Kieran did not look at her again. When the priest declared them bound under the laws of the High Alpha throne and the ancient rites of the moon, Kieran turned and walked off the dais, without offering his arm, without a word, without acknowledging that 300 witnesses had just watched the most powerful wolf in the realm buckle like a yearling at his first shift. Ember was led away by Marin, who said nothing but wrapped a steadying arm around her waist when Ember's legs finally gave out in the corridor. They put her in a room at the far end of the royal wing, not the queen's chamber. That door, Marin explained without explaining, remained locked. This was a guest suite, comfortable. A bed with actual blankets, a fireplace with wood already stacked, a window that looked out over the eastern valley, where the lights of the fortress town glittered like fallen stars. The message was unmistakable. "You are here, but you are not home." Ember sat on the edge of the bed. The silk gown whispered around her like accusations. She opened the locket with trembling fingers and stared at the moon petal inside. Its edges were translucent, delicate. It carried a bare whisper of something floral, and night blooming, a scent that belonged to a world Ember had never known. She had just been married to the most powerful alpha alive, and he couldn't even look at her. The hours crawled. No one came, no dinner, no attendant, no explanation. Ember was accustomed to being forgotten. It was in some ways the only skill she had perfected. The ability to exist in a space without claiming it, to breathe without taking up air that someone else might need. But this flavor of abandonment had a new, sharper edge. She had seen his face when the veil dropped, had watched his body rebel against his pride, had heard him say in a voice that sounded like it was tearing him apart that he'd seen her scar every night for 20 years. And then she had watched him choose pride anyway. At midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor. She knew they were his because no other strides shook the floorboards like a minor seismic event. Heavy, deliberate. The gait of a man who had never learned to move quietly because he'd never needed to. The footsteps paused outside her door. Ember held her breath. 3 seconds, 5, 10. The footsteps moved on. Down the hall, a door opened and closed. And through the stone walls, thick as they were, Ember heard a sound she would never forget. A deep, guttural snarl, followed by the unmistakable crash of furniture being destroyed. The king was tearing his own room apart. Ember pressed the locket against her chest and closed her eyes. In the stories her mother used to tell, before the fever took her, the mate bond was beautiful. A golden thread connecting two souls across any distance. Unbreakable. Sacred. But her mother had also told her that wolves could be their own worst enemies. That pride was the alpha's original sin, and that the strongest men were often the most afraid of surrender. Kieran Blackthorn had found his mate, and his first instinct was to deny it. Ember understood the calculus. A wolfless queen was a political catastrophe. It would make him look weak, invite challenges from rival alphas, destabilize alliances built on the assumption that the high throne would produce wolf-blooded heirs strong enough to hold the territories together. She understood because she had spent her entire life being the thing people calculated around, the variable that made every equation worse. But understanding did not dull the blade. She was still bleeding quietly when sleep finally came, the locket warm against her collarbone. the moon petal inside it trembling with every breath as if it too was trying not to cry. 3 days passed in a fog of avoidance. Kieran governed from the war chamber and took his meals there. Ember never saw him, not in the corridors, not in the courtyards, not even from a distance. It was as if he'd calculated the exact radius of her existence and built his life around the perimeter. Marin brought her food, plain but plentiful, more than Ember had eaten in years. Bread with butter, roasted meat, vegetables that still had flavor. "Eat," Marin said the first morning, setting the tray on the table by the window. "You look like a strong wind could break you in half." Ember ate, not because she was hungry, her stomach was a knot of anxiety that didn't have room for food, but because refusing felt like giving up, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. She explored the castle in careful peripheral orbits. The library, where shelves climbed 3 stories and the smell of old paper and leather was so thick it felt like breathing history. The kitchen gardens, still brown with winter but showing the first green shoots of early spring bulbs. The lower courtyards where the servants' children played tag between the storage sheds and their laughter echoed off stone walls. Ember moved the way she had always moved, like smoke, occupying spaces without claiming them. The staff watched her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The court watched with naked contempt. On the second day, Lady Cassandra Frost cornered her in the library. Cassandra was beautiful in the way that razor wire is beautiful. Sharp, elegant, designed to draw blood. She was the Alpha consort of the Northern Ridge Territory, one of the 13 regions that made up the High Alpha's domain. Ice blonde hair, pale blue eyes, a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her face. "So," Cassandra said, circling Ember like a wolf circles wounded prey. "You're the wolfless bride." Ember said nothing. She held the book she'd been reading, a treatise on Lycan territorial law, and let the words wash over her like rain on stone. "I expected something more substantial," Cassandra continued. She leaned closer. Her perfume was cloying, aggressive, designed to assert dominance in the scent-driven hierarchy of wolf politics. "You do know what they're saying, don't you? That the king's bond instinct misfired. That you're a defect and his wolf is confused." Ember's fingers tightened on the book. She didn't respond. "He's going to annul," Cassandra said. The words dripped with satisfaction. "By the quarter moon, everyone knows it. He's already consulting the elders. You'll be back in whatever hovel you crawled out of within the week." Ember looked at her then. Really looked. Cassandra, who had broken lesser wolves with a single withering glance, took a half step back. Ember's eyes were silver white, not gray, not pale blue. Silver like moonlight condensed into liquid and poured into irises. They had always been this way. Her mother had called them beautiful. Everyone since had called them wrong. "Thank you for telling me," Ember said quietly. "Is there anything else?" Cassandra's smile faltered. For just a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across her face. Then she turned and left her heels clicking against the stone floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down. Ember closed the book. She sat in the empty library for a long time after that, staring at nothing, the locket heavy against her chest. That night, Ember couldn't sleep. She walked the corridors in bare feet, the stone cold enough to ache. The locket swung against her throat. She found herself climbing. Up through the torch-lit stairwells, past the guard rotations onto the castle's highest parapet. The moon was almost full. It hung above Ironhaven like a lantern painting the mountain in silver. The wind carried the scent of snow from distant peaks and the sharp, clean smell of pine forests that stretched for 100 miles in every direction. The temperature was below freezing. Ember's breath came out in clouds. She didn't care. She tipped her face upward and let the moonlight fall across the crescent scar, and felt it. The thing she'd spent 19 years pretending didn't exist. A vibration, deep, subsonic, like a note played on a string too low for human ears, but felt in the bones anyway. It resonated in her chest, in the architecture of her ribs, in the chambers of her heart. It was not a wolf, it was something else. Something that lived in the same space a wolf would occupy but filled it differently. Not with animal fury, but with a luminous, aching presence that had no name. The moon petal in her locket began to glow. Ember opened the clasp with shaking hands. The pressed flower, translucent, dry dead for 19 years, was emitting a faint white light, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She stared at it. Her breath clouded the air, and tears tracked down her cheeks for the first time in years. She wasn't wolfless. She'd known it somewhere beneath the layers of shame and survival. The way you know the sun exists on a cloudy day, not because you can see it, but because the world is still lit. "You shouldn't be up here." Kieran's voice came from behind her, and Ember nearly dropped the locket over the parapet's edge. She spun. He stood 10 feet away, loose shirt and trousers, feet bare on the cold stone. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The skin beneath his gold eyes was bruised with exhaustion, and his jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. His gaze dropped to the glowing locket. His whole body went rigid. "Where did you get that?" The question was hoarse, raw. "My mother," Ember said. Her voice shook. "She gave it to me when I was born." "Your mother." He took a step forward, then stopped, as if an invisible wall had risen between them. "What was her name?" Liana Ashwell." Ember swallowed. "Before she married my stepfather, her name was Liana Moonvale." Kieran made a sound, small, involuntary, something between recognition and pain. He passed a hand over his face. When it dropped, his expression had changed. The stone mask had cracked again, and underneath was not the kneeling man from the altar, but something older, something grief-stricken and bewildered. "The Moonvale bloodline," he said slowly, "was supposed to be extinct. They were lunar lichens. The last ones died in the Thornridge purges." He stared at her. "My father's purges." Ember's breath caught. "Your mother survived," Kieran continued. His voice was barely audible over the wind. "She hid. She married Thorn to disappear. And then she died. And you," Ember's voice broke. "I was left." She pressed the glowing locket to her chest. The wind howled between them. "You're not wolfless," Kieran said. The words seemed to cost him something enormous. "You're lunar. Your wolf doesn't surface the way ours does. It manifests through light, through the bond itself. That's why the mate bond hits so hard with lunar lichens. That's why I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "That's why I couldn't stay standing." Ember looked at him. This towering, scarred, tortured king who had spent 3 days hiding from a girl half his size, and understood with sudden clarity that he was more afraid of her than she had ever been of him. "Then why are you running?" she asked. He had no answer. The moon watched them both and said nothing. The annulment petition arrived on the morning of the 5th day. It was delivered by Elder Thorn, no relation to Ember's stepfather, though the name still made her flinch, the oldest member of the Lichen High Council. A man whose face looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the castle walls and left in the weather for a century. He placed the parchment on the war chamber table with the ceremony of someone laying a body to rest. Kieran stood at the head of the table. He had not slept. Ember knew this because Marin had mentioned in the careful way of someone pretending not to gossip that the king's chamber lights had burned until dawn for 3 nights running. "The council's position is unanimous, my king," Elder Thorn said. His voice crackled like old leather. "A wolfless bride, regardless of the mate bond, undermines the throne's authority." He paused. Let the words settle like stones into water. "The territory alphas are already questioning your judgment. 5 of the 13 have sent formal inquiries. Lord Thorn Ashwell has withdrawn his oath of fealty, entirely citing the arrangement as a deliberate insult to his house. And Lady Cassandra's faction has circulated a counter-petition for a new bride selection. 127 signatures from noble families across the territories." Kieran's gold eyes rested on the parchment. He had not touched it. His massive hands gripped the edge of the table, instead knuckles white with pressure. "And if I refuse the annulment," his voice was flat, emotionless. Elder Thorn's expression did not change. "Then the council will invoke Article 17, removal of a sitting monarch by majority vote on grounds of compromise instinct." The room was full. Advisors, commanders, the inner circle of the Blackthorn court. Every face was carefully neutral, which meant every face was afraid. An alpha king whose instincts were being publicly questioned was an alpha king on the edge of civil war. Kieran looked at Ronan Graves. The old general stood near the window arms, crossed face unreadable. He met Kieran's eyes and gave the smallest shake of his head. "Not now, not yet. You'll lose this fight." Kieran picked up the quill, dipped it in ink, and signed his name at the bottom of the annulment petition. The scratch of the nib against parchment was the loudest sound in the world. The news reached Ember through Marin, who delivered it with a cup of chamomile tea and the particular gentleness of someone handing you a loaded weapon. "He signed it this morning," Marin said. She set the cup on the table by the window. Steam rose in delicate spirals. "The annulment will be formalized at the next council session. You'll be escorted back to Ashwell territory within the week." Ember's hands did not tremble. She had survived too many endings to fall apart at another one. But something behind her sternum, the luminous subsonic presence that the moonlight had awakened on the parapet, contracted like a fist. "Back to Ashwell," she repeated. Marin sat beside her on the bed. The older woman's wolf scent was warm, herbal like rosemary and wood smoke. She smelled like someone who had spent a lifetime tending things. Unless you have somewhere else to go, Marin said quietly. Ember didn't. They both knew it. Marin was silent for a moment. Then she reached out and took Ember's hand. Her palm was rough, calloused from decades of work. He's not a bad man, Marin said. He's a frightened one. There's a difference, though it doesn't always feel that way from this side. I know, Ember said. Do you? Marin squeezed her hand once. Then don't pack yet. She stood, smoothed her apron, and left. Ember sat alone in the guest suite of Bjornton. The chamomile tea went cold untouched. She opened the locket and stared at the moon petal inside. The glow from the previous night had faded. It was just a pressed flower again. Fragile. Dead, except it wasn't dead. She knew that now. It had been waiting. Ember closed the locket and made a decision. She wouldn't pack. She wouldn't leave quietly. She wouldn't make it easy for them to forget her. If Kieran Blackthorne wanted to throw her away, he would have to do it while looking her in the eyes. What happened next was not something Ember planned. It happened because Ironhaven was a fortress full of wolves, and wolves notice everything. The kitchen staff noticed first. On the sixth day, Ember came down to the kitchens. Not because she had to. Marin had made it clear that meals would be brought to her room, but because sitting alone in that guest suite felt like suffocating. The kitchens were chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos nonetheless. 20 people working in practiced synchronization. The head cook, a barrel-chested man named Bram, with soot-stained apron and 2 fingers missing from his left hand, orchestrated the operation like a general commanding troops. Ember stood in the doorway uncertain. Bram looked up, saw her, and instead of the contempt she expected, his weathered face softened. You hungry, girl? Ember hesitated. I don't want to be in the way. Then don't stand in the doorway. Bram jerked his head toward an empty stool. Sit, peel those potatoes. If you're going to be here, you're going to work. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. Ember sat. She peeled potatoes for an hour while the kitchen moved around her. Bram's daughter, Willa, 8 years old with braids coming loose and flour on her nose, climbed onto the stool next to Ember's and watched her work. You're the queen, Willa said, not a question, a statement of fact delivered with the brutal honesty of children. I suppose I am, Ember said, but you don't have a wolf. No, I don't. Willa considered this. My first shift is supposed to happen at the next full moon. I'm scared. Ember set down the potato, looked at the girl. Why? What if I can't do it? What if my wolf doesn't come? The fear in Willa's voice was so familiar it ached. Ember reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Willa's ear. Then you and I will be brave together. Willa smiled, small and tentative, but real. Over the next 3 days, Ember came back to the kitchens. She learned Bram's nephew's name, a gangly 12-year-old apprentice cook who was trying to master bread and failing spectacularly. She showed him how to knead dough with patience instead of force, gentle, persistent pressure, the same way she'd learned to survive. The bread rose perfectly. Bram watched from across the kitchen and said nothing. But the next morning there was a warm cloak hanging on a peg by the door with a note in crude handwriting, For morning work, you'll catch cold. B. The stable hands noticed on the 7th day. Ember had always felt more comfortable around animals than people. Animals didn't calculate your worth based on bloodlines or wolf signatures. They responded to presence, to gentleness. The castle stables housed 43 horses, draft animals riding mounts, and 3 war horses that belonged to the king himself. Ember slipped in through the side door just after dawn. The smell of hay and horse and leather oil wrapped around her like a blanket. The head stable master, a gruff man named Tor with a face like cracked leather and hands scarred from decades of handling reins, looked up from mucking stalls. Help you with something? I just wanted to, Ember gestured vaguely. I like horses. Tor grunted, went back to his work. Ember moved down the aisle, stopped at a stall where a skittish gelding stood in the corner, ears pinned back, whites of his eyes showing. That one threw 3 riders last week, Tor called. He's mean. He's scared, Ember corrected quietly. She opened the stall door slowly, didn't approach the horse, just stood there, hand extended, and waited. The gelding watched her, nostrils flaring, every muscle tense. Ember hummed, not a song exactly, just a low, steady sound that vibrated in her chest and filled the stall. 20 minutes later, the horse's nose was pressed into her palm. Tor stood in the aisle, pitchfork, forgotten, staring. The next morning, there was a wool cloak, different from Bram's heavier, draped over the stall door, with a note, For morning visits, cold out, my tea, the soldiers noticed on the 8th day. Ember had started walking the battlements at dawn. 5:30 in the morning when the temperature hovered around 20 degrees and her breath came out in thick clouds. The guards on duty would nod as she passed, wary at first, then simply acknowledging. There was a young soldier barely 18 named Finn, first posting. He stood his watch near the eastern tower and tried so hard to look experienced that it was obvious he wasn't. "Good morning," Ember said the first time she passed him. Finn, startled, snapped to attention. "Ma'am, I mean your majesty, Ember is fine." He blinked. "That's not proper." "Then be improper." She smiled. "What's your name?" "Finn, Finnegan Marsh, from the southern border territory." "Do you miss home?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Every day." They talked for 10 minutes. About his family, 3 younger sisters, parents who ran a small farm. About how different the fortress felt from the open grasslands where he'd grown up. About how he'd volunteered for the King's Guard because it was an honor, but he hadn't realized honor would feel so much like loneliness. Ember understood loneliness. She came back the next morning and the next, always stopping to talk to Finn for a few minutes. Just enough to remind him that someone saw him, that he wasn't invisible. By the 9th day, every guard on the eastern wall knew her name. The children noticed most of all. To the court, a wolfless queen was a scandal, an insult, a political catastrophe waiting to unfold. But to the children of Ironhaven, the pups who hadn't yet learned to rank the world by fang and claw, Ember was simply kind. She found them in the lower courtyard on the 10th day. A dozen children between the ages of 5 and 12 playing a game that involved a lot of running and shrieking and rules that seemed to change every 30 seconds. One little boy, maybe 6 years old, sat apart from the others, watching but not joining. Ember sat down next to him on the stone bench. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus." He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the other children. "Why aren't you playing?" "Because I'm different." The words hit Ember like a fist to the sternum. "Different how?" she asked gently. "My wolf hasn't come yet. Everyone says it should have by now. They say maybe it won't ever come. That I'm broken." Ember was quiet for a long moment. Then she took the boy's small hand in hers. "I don't have a wolf either," she said. Marcus looked at her then, really looked. "You don't?" "No, and for a long time I thought that meant I was broken too. But I was wrong." "How do you know?" "Because being different doesn't mean being less. It just means being you." Marcus considered this with the gravity of someone 3 times his age. Then he leaned against her shoulder. "Will you tell me a story?" he asked. So Ember told him about the Moonvale clan, the stories her mother had whispered in the dark before fever took her, about wolves who ran under moonlight and could see in complete darkness, about a time before territories and treaties when packs lived free in the wilderness, and the only law was the bond between wolves. By the time she finished, there were 8 children sitting around her, listening with wide eyes. They came back the next day, and the next. By the 12th day, Ember held story time every afternoon in the lower courtyard. 15 children, sometimes 20, sitting in a circle while she spoke. And the wolves came, real wolves, shifted lichens in their animal forms. A gray wolf appeared first, lying outside the kitchen door where Ember entered every morning. Not threatening, not guarding, just there, present. Then a pair of tawny yearlings began following her along the battlement walls, 15 feet behind, pacing matching hers exactly. On the 11th day, a massive black wolf, easily 250 pounds, with a silver-shot muzzle and scars across its shoulders, sat at the edge of the courtyard while Ember told stories. Merrin whispered to Ember later that the black wolf was Ronan Graves, the general, the king's oldest friend, the man who commanded 5,000 soldiers. And he sat like a patient dog while Ember braided children's hair and told them they were brave. The pack bond is not a document. It is not a law written on parchment and stored in vaults. It is a living thing, an electromagnetic web of scent and proximity and care and belonging that connects every wolf to every other wolf in the territory, and it does not care about politics. By the 12th day, the pack bond of Ironhaven had begun threading itself around Ember Moonvale like ivy around a trellis. The wolves felt it, the real wolves, the ones who shifted and ran the forest and lived half their lives in fur and fang. They felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, the way a compass needle feels north. She belonged here, not because a ceremony said so, not because a king had claimed her, because the pack itself had chosen. And Kieran Blackthorn, locked in his war chamber with maps and treaties and the weight of a crown he had never wanted, felt every single thread as it wove into place. His wolf howled inside his chest. For the first time in his life, the giant Alpha King did not know how to make it stop. The council session was scheduled for midday on the 12th day. The chamber was circular. Built in the oldest part of the fortress where the stones still bore claw marks from wolves that had lived centuries before any of them were born. 13 seats arranged in a crescent around a stone table, torches burning low in iron sconces. The annulment parchment lay at the center of the table. Kieran's signature stark against the cream-colored vellum. Ember was not invited. Brides, especially wolfless ones, did not attend council proceedings. She attended anyway. The doors were 12 feet tall, solid ironwood banded with steel. They weighed 300 pounds each. Ember pushed them open with both hands. The boom of their movement silenced the chamber like a thunderclap. Every head turned. 13 council elders in formal robes. 20 attendants standing along the walls. Kieran at the head of the crescent table dressed in full ceremonial armor, gold eyes wide with shock. Ember walked forward. She was wearing the same white gown from the wedding ceremony, the only formal garment she owned. Her dark hair was unbound, falling past her shoulders. The locket gleamed at her throat, catching torchlight. The crescent scar shone like a brand. She stopped at the center of the room, close enough to the table that she could see Kieran's signature on the parchment, close enough that every word would carry. "I was not going to speak," she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the acoustics of the ancient chamber, it reached every corner. "I have spent my entire life not speaking, because I was told that a girl without a wolf has nothing worth saying, and I believed it. For 19 years, I believed it." She looked directly at Kieran. "3 days ago on the parapet, you told me what I am. Lunar. Not wolfless, different. And I spent all the years since my mother died thinking the absence I felt was a deficiency, a failure of blood." She touched the locket. "But it isn't. It's a different kind of presence, one that doesn't roar but resonates." Silence. Absolute. Crushing. "I'm not here to beg you to keep me," Ember continued. "I would never beg for belonging. I've learned that lesson. I'm here because this pack has shown me something in 7 days that I never received in 19 years. Acceptance without condition." She gestured toward the door, toward the fortress beyond. "Your cook knows my name. Your stable master trusts me with his horses. Your soldiers nod to me on the wall. And your wolves," her voice wavered, just slightly, "your wolves lie down at my feet, and I don't even know why, except that maybe they can feel what you're too proud to admit." Elder Thorne shifted in his seat. Lady Cassandra stood near the wall, arms crossed, wearing an expression like she'd bitten into something rotten. Ember looked back at Kieran. His gold eyes were fixed on her face, unblinking. "You're afraid that keeping me makes you weak," she said, "but you signed that paper." She pointed at the annulment petition. "And that is the weakest thing you've ever done. Not because you're abandoning me, because you're abandoning yourself. Your wolf recognized me. Your instincts have been screaming for 12 days. And you chose politics over truth because you're terrified of what it means to need someone." Kieran's hands gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles had gone white. "I won't fight an annulment," Ember said. She drew a breath, steadied herself. "If this council decides I'm not fit to stand beside you, I'll leave, and I'll survive, because that's all I've ever done." She paused. "But I wanted all of you to know that the decision you're making isn't about whether a wolfless girl deserves a crown. It's about whether this kingdom has the courage to see something it's never seen before." She touched the locket one last time, turned toward the door. "Wait." Kieran's voice hit the room like a physical force. Not a command, though it carried the weight of one. A plea dressed in the only language his pride allowed. Ember stopped, did not turn around. Behind her she heard movement, the groan of armor, the scrape of boots on stone, and then a sound that made every elder in the room inhale sharply. The sound of the giant Alpha King's knees hitting the floor. This time it was voluntary. "I am not a good man," Kieran said. His voice was stripped raw. Every word cost him something enormous. "My father was a butcher, and I have spent my life trying to be anything other than what he was. And I have failed in ways I don't know how to name." Ember turned. He was on his knees. 7 feet of Wolf King, armored and scarred, kneeling on the stone floor of the council chamber. His head was not bowed. He was looking directly at her. "I signed that paper because I was afraid," he said. "One of you, of deserving you." He reached for the annulment petition, picked it up slowly, deliberately, and tore it in half. The sound of ripping parchment was the loudest thing in the world. The 2 pieces fell to the stone floor like shed skin. "I, Kieran Blackthorne, Alpha King of the High Throne, reject this annulment," he said, his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "I claim Ember Moonveil as my mate, my Luna, my equal." He looked at the council, at the elders who had demanded this, at Cassandra, whose face had gone pale. at Ronan, who stood near the window with arms crossed and something that might have been approval in his eyes. And if any wolf in this chamber challenges that claim, Kieran's gold eyes blazed. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. They can take it up with me, personally. No one moved, no one breathed. Ember walked forward, slowly, each step deliberate. She stopped in front of him, close enough that she could see the wet shine in his gold eyes that he was fighting desperately to contain. She reached out and placed her hand against his scarred cheek. His eyes closed. A shudder ran through his massive frame. Not weakness, release. The sound he made was almost inaudible. A low, broken exhale like a door that had been locked for years finally swinging open. The locket at Ember's throat began to glow. Soft at first, then brighter. White light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. In the chamber, one by one, the wolves felt it. A pulse. A warmth spreading outward from the place where her skin met his. Threading through the pack bond like electricity through copper wire. Elder Thorne's eyes widened. One of the younger council members, a woman from the Eastern Territories, gasped. Ronan's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. The pack bond didn't just accept Ember. It sang. A vibration that every lichen in the fortress felt in their bones. Not sound. Something deeper. The harmonic frequency of a pack recognizing its Luna. Kieran opened his eyes, looked up at Ember, and for the first time since the veil had dropped 7 days ago, he let her see him. All of him. The fear and the longing and the desperate, aching hope that maybe against all logic this could work. "I'll probably fail you," he said quietly. "I don't know how to do this." "Then we'll learn together," Ember said. She helped him to his feet, or tried to. He was too large, too heavy, but he let her guide him up, her small hands wrapped around his, and that meant more than strength ever could. They stood facing each other in the center of the council chamber, the torn annulment at their feet, and outside in the courtyard, in the barracks, in the kitchens and stables and lower halls, 5,000 wolves felt the bond shift and settle into place. The gray wolf that had been lying outside the kitchen door lifted its head and howled. The tawny yearlings on the battlement wall joined in. Ronan Graves shifted without warning, bones cracking, reforming. His black wolf threw back its head and added its voice to the chorus. Within seconds, the entire fortress was howling. Not a war cry, a celebration, a declaration of belonging. Ember closed her eyes. The lunar resonance rose from deep in her chest, answering the pack's call, threading through their voices, weaving them together, amplifying them, until the sound was no longer individual wolves, but a single unified song. The moon petal in the locket blazed like a star. And Kieran Blackthorne, the Alpha King, who had conquered 3 territories and never shed a tear, stood beside his mate in the council chamber and felt for the first time in his life that the thing inside him that had always been broken might learn to heal. The resistance came swift and predictable. By sunset, on the day Kieran tore the annulment, Lady Cassandra Frost had withdrawn from court. She took 40 noble families with her. An entire convoy of carriages rolling north toward the Ridge Territory's banners, snapping in the wind like declarations of war. The message was clear: she would not bend the knee to a wolfless Luna. Lord Thorne Ashwell sent a letter from his keep 300 miles south. Ronan read it aloud at the war table, his weathered face impassive, while Kieran listened with hands folded and jaw tight. The letter was vicious. It accused Kieran of perverting the ancient bloodlines, of dooming the throne to extinction, of elevating a defective whelp to mock the traditions that have sustained our people for 1,000 years. When Ronan finished reading, he walked to the fireplace and fed the parchment to the flames. "Thorne Ashwell is a coward and a fool," Ronan said, watching the paper curl and blacken. And his oath was worthless long before he withdrew it. 2 minor territory alphas retracted their alliance pledges within the week. Western Shore and Riverbend. Small territories, 800 lichens combined, tucked into coastal regions where pack politics mattered less than fishing quotas and trade routes. Their letters were formal, respectful even, but the meaning was the same. They did not trust a throne held by a king who chose his mate over his kingdom. Elder Thorne, the counselor, not the stepfather, resigned his seat with a letter that was by comparison almost kind. He cited irreconcilable differences in governance philosophy and wished the king well. Kieran read the resignation in his war chamber, set it down on the table, stared at it for a long time. "How many does that make?" he asked quietly. Ronan stood by the window, arms crossed, watching snow begin to fall over the courtyard. 4 territories lost or wavering. 9 holding firm. 9 out of 13. 78% of the total lichen population, Ronan said. 85% of military strength. The territories that remain are the ones governed through loyalty, not leverage. He turned from the window, met Kieran's eyes. Your father chose power over bond, Ronan said, and it killed him. You just chose bond over power. It might save you. He paused. Don't waste it. Kieran didn't waste it. He couldn't. Because Ember wouldn't let him. She did not become a conventional Luna. There was no formal investiture ceremony in those first weeks, no silk gowns or state banquets, or carefully choreographed appearances before the court. Ember did something far more dangerous. She made herself necessary. She continued working in the kitchens, 3 hours every morning from dawn until the breakfast service ended. Not because she had to. Marin had made it abundantly clear that the Luna was not expected to peel potatoes, but because the rhythm of labor was the only language of worth she had ever been taught, and she was learning slowly to translate it into something new. Service, not servitude. Presence, not performance. Bram's nephew, the gangly 12-year-old, who had been struggling with bread, mastered the technique within a week under Ember's patient instruction. She showed him how to feel the dough, how to know when it had been kneaded enough, not by counting time, but by listening to the texture. You can't force it, she told him, hands covered in flour. You have to let it teach you. The boy nodded, serious as a scholar. The next day, his bread rose perfectly. Golden crust, soft interior, the smell filling the entire kitchen. Bram clapped his nephew on the shoulder, pride written across his soot-stained face. But when the boy wasn't looking, Bram caught Ember's eye and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. She sat with the healers. Ironhaven's medical corps consisted of 3 elderly women who had been tending wounded wolves for 40 years each. They worked in the lower keep in rooms that smelled of herbs and blood and the particular antiseptic sharpness of silverleaf tincture. Ember appeared in their workroom on the 14th day and asked if she could learn. The head healer, a woman named Azra with white braids and hands gnarled by arthritis, looked her up and down. You're the Luna, Azra said. Not a question. I am. And you want to learn healing? Yes. Why? Ember considered the question. Because I want to be useful. And because I think there's something in me that could help. Azra studied her for a long moment. Then she gestured to a stool. Sit, we'll start with wolfsbane. Over the next 2 weeks, Ember learned the names of herbs. Wolfsbane, which in carefully measured doses reduced fever, but in excess caused seizures. Silverleaf, which cleaned wounds and prevented infection. Moonwort, a rare plant that only grew at high altitudes and had properties the healers themselves didn't fully understand. Except it grew faster when Ember was near it. Azra noticed first. A pot of moonwort that had been struggling to root suddenly sprouted 3 new leaves overnight after Ember had spent an hour sitting beside it, learning to grind dried petals into powder. That's not normal, Azra said, pointing at the plant with a crooked finger. Ember touched the leaves gently. They seemed to lean toward her hand. No, she agreed. It's not. But it was useful. Within 3 weeks, the moonwort in the healer's garden had tripled in size, and the recovery time for wounded soldiers dropped from an average of 8 days to 6. Azra said nothing about it directly, but she started asking Ember to sit with the most severely injured. Just sit, in a chair beside their beds while they slept, and they healed faster. The wolves felt it, that same subsonic vibration Ember had felt on the parapet, like a frequency that their bodies recognized and responded to, even when their minds didn't understand it. Lunar resonance, Kieran had called it. Ember was beginning to understand what that meant. She visited the elderly wolves. In the lower keep in rooms that the court forgot existed lived 43 lichens too old to shift anymore. Wolves who had lost the ability to transform, whose bodies had aged past the point where bone and sinew could reshape themselves. They were fed, housed, given basic medical care, but they were lonely. Ember found them on the 16th day, led there by Marin, who mentioned in passing that the old ones don't get many visitors. She knocked on the door of the first room, a small space with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the northern valley. An old woman sat in a chair by the window. 80 years old, maybe more. Her hair was white as fresh snow. Her hands shook with palsy. Who are you? The woman asked. Her voice was sharp, suspicious. My name is Ember. I'm the Luna. The woman snorted. The wolfless one, I heard. That's me. What do you want? Ember sat down on the floor, her back against the wall. I thought you might like some company. The woman, her name was Magda Ember, stared at her for a full minute. Then she started talking. She talked about her mate who had died in the Thornridge purges 30 years ago. About the life they had built together in the eastern forests before Kieran's father had decided that certain bloodlines were too dangerous to survive. She talked for 4 hours. Ember listened. She came back the next day, and the next. By the end of the second week, Magda was smiling when Ember arrived. And on the 20th day, the old woman pressed a hand-carved wooden wolf into Ember's palm. For luck, Magda said. Her eyes were wet. My mate carved it for me 60 years ago. I want you to have it. Ember tried to refuse. I can't take this. It's too precious. That's exactly why you should have it. Magda closed Ember's fingers around the carving. Precious things should go to people who understand their value. Ember wore the wooden wolf on a cord around her neck next to the locket. The pack responded, not with declarations or ceremonies, with the quiet, inevitable pull of gravity. Wolves who had been reluctant to accept a wolfless Luna, who had watched the council session with skepticism and the annulment drama with barely concealed contempt, found themselves drifting toward her without understanding why. It started small. A soldier asking her opinion on where to position new recruits during drills. A mother bringing her sick child to Ember instead of the healers because the Luna has a gentle touch. A visiting alpha from one of the neutral territories requesting an audience with Ember, specifically not Kieran, to discuss a border dispute that had been simmering for months. Ember sat with the alpha, a grizzled man in his 60s named Corbin, who ruled the Western Shore territory and listened to his grievances about fishing rights and trade routes. The previous Luna would have told me to take it up with the War Council, Corbin said. I'm not the previous Luna, Ember replied. And it sounds like the real issue isn't the fishing rights. It's that your people feel unheard. Corbin blinked. Yes, exactly. Then let's fix that. She arranged a meeting between Corbin's representatives and Kieran's trade council, mediated the first session herself, found the compromise that both sides could live with. Western Shore reaffirmed its alliance oath 2 weeks later. Ronan watched the whole thing unfold from his position at the war table. When Kieran asked him what he thought of Ember's negotiation style, the old general's mouth curved into something that might have been approval. She governs through connection, Ronan said. Not control, it's more effective than anything we've tried in 30 years. Kieran watched her. Every day he watched her. And every day the walls he had built around himself lost another stone. He found himself leaving the war chamber door open when she passed in the corridor, just so he could see her, just for a moment. She would pause. Their eyes would meet. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in those silent seconds. An acknowledgement, a question, the slow, careful unfurling of trust. On the 19th day, Kieran brought her a book. He didn't announce it, didn't make a grand gesture, just left it on her nightstand while she was in the kitchens. A history of the Moonvale bloodline. 340 pages leather-bound, recovered from the fortress archives. It smelled like dust and old paper and secrets. Ember found it that evening, opened it with trembling hands, read through the night candles burning down to nubs until she knew the names of her ancestors. The lunar alphas, who had governed through light instead of force, who had been hunted to extinction because their power was too strange, too different, too threatening to the established order. Her mother had been the last, and now Ember was. She appeared at breakfast the next morning with red-rimmed eyes and a steadiness that shook Kieran more than tears would have. They sat across from each other at the small table in his private dining room. Not the formal hall, just the two of them. My mother was the last lunar alpha, Ember said. Her voice was quiet but firm. She gave up her wolf to hide, folded it into the locket so it would survive, even if she didn't. Kieran set down his cup. His hands were steady, but his eyes were intense. She gave you her wolf. She gave me her light. Ember touched the locket. There's a difference. Silence stretched between them. 30 seconds, not awkward, waited. My father killed her bloodline, Kieran said finally, and now I'm trying to. He stopped, swallowed hard. Help it survive, Ember finished for him. That's what matters. He looked at her, really looked. The way he had on the altar when the veil dropped, but without the fear this time, was something that felt dangerously close to hope. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Neither do I. Ember's mouth curved. We'll figure it out. They didn't rush. That was important. Perhaps the most important thing. Ember didn't demand intimacy, and Kieran didn't pretend he was ready for it. They existed in parallel orbits, circling each other with the careful attention of two people who had each been hurt so deeply that trust was archaeology, something that had to be excavated fragment by fragment from beneath years of rubble. But the fragments accumulated. On the 23rd day, Ember was in the library, reading Lycan territorial law, trying to understand the complex web of treaties and alliances that held the 13 territories together. Kieran found her there, stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before speaking. Why are you reading governance law? She looked up. Because I'm your Luna, and I should understand how this kingdom works if I'm going to help you lead it. It was the first time she had claimed the title directly to his face. He crossed the room, sat down across from her, and for the next 2 hours he explained the treaty structures, the hierarchy of bloodlines, the inheritance laws that determine which families held power in which territories. It was the most intimate conversation they'd had, not because of what they said, but because Kieran was sharing his world with him, his knowledge, his responsibility, the weight he carried alone. When they finally stood to leave, his hand brushed hers on the table. Neither of them pulled away. On the 28th day, they walked the battlements at dawn. It had become a routine. 4 in the morning, when the temperature hovered around 20 degrees and the stars were still visible. The guards knew to expect them now, would nod as they passed but keep their distance. They stopped at the eastern tower, watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold, and rose. "I used to come up here after my father died," Kieran said. His breath clouded the air. "Trying to figure out how to be king. I never found the answer." Ember looked at him. "Maybe because you were looking for how to be him, not how to be you." Kieran was quiet for a long moment. Then, "When I saw your scar when the veil dropped, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for 20 years and could finally exhale. So why did you run?" "Because I didn't think I deserved to breathe." Ember took his hand, the first time she had initiated touch. His fingers closed around hers, carefully, as if she might break. "Then learn," she said. The sun cleared the mountain peaks. Light spilled across the fortress, warm and golden, and for the first time since the wedding, Kieran smiled. Small, tentative, but real. 3 weeks and Ember kissed him. They were in his study, late evening. He was reviewing supply reports for the northern garrisons. She had brought him tea, a habit she'd picked up from Marin, and set the cup on his desk. He looked up to thank her, and she leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Soft and careful and over, almost before it began. When she pulled back, Kieran's eyes were wide, stunned. He started. "Don't apologize," Ember said, "and don't ask if you deserve that. You did." That night he came to her room, knocked softly on the door. She opened it. "I don't know how to be gentle," he said. "I've been a weapon my whole life." "Then learn with me," Ember said. She took his hand and led him inside. 6 weeks after the annulment was torn, they held the formal investiture ceremony. It was small, no visiting dignitaries, no political theater. Just the core pack gathered in the central courtyard under open sky. Kieran placed the Luna circlet on Ember's head himself. Not the old gold crown that had belonged to previous queens. A new one forged specifically for her. Silver and moonstone, delicate but strong. His hands lingered on her temples. She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the bond between them hummed like a plucked string. "I was wrong," he said quietly, for her ears only. "For weeks." "I know, though. I'll probably be wrong again. I know that too." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. The first genuine smile anyone at Ironhaven had seen from their king in living memory. The pack howled. It started with the shifted wolves. The gray and tawny and black shapes scattered through the courtyard, heads thrown back, voices rising in a chorus that was not music exactly, but something older and more honest. The sound spread to the human form lichens, throats tipping skyward. Joining in, a declaration of belonging, a territorial claim made not with teeth but with throat. Ember closed her eyes. The lunar resonance rose from deep in her chest, answering. Threading through the pack's howl, weaving through it, amplifying it, turning a chorus into a symphony. The moon petal in the locket blazed, and Kieran Blackthorn stood beside his mate in the courtyard and felt for the first time in his life that the thing inside him that had always been broken might with enough patience learn to heal. That night they consummated the bond fully. Careful, tender, reverent. Afterward he held her like she might disappear. His massive frame curled around her smaller one, protective and vulnerable in equal measure. "I can't lose you," he whispered into her hair. "I wouldn't survive it." "You won't lose me," Ember promised. "I'm not going anywhere." The bond flared, a pulse of warmth that every wolf in the fortress felt in their bones. They fell asleep tangled together, the locket glowing softly between them. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Ember did not take over the court. She didn't need to. She governed through presence, not pronouncement. She expanded the healer network, working with Azra to recruit and train younger wolves. Within a month, the infirmary overcrowding had decreased by 40%. She established a formal support system for elderly wolves who had lost their ability to shift. Housing, medical care, community integration. Magda became the unofficial leader of the group, her sharp tongue and sharper mind, organizing social gatherings and skill-sharing sessions. She created a school for young wolves, ages 5 to 12, teaching both human knowledge, reading arithmetic, history, and wolf culture. The stories of the old packs, the meaning behind the bonds. And when territory disputes arose, Kieran began asking for her input, not as a formality, because her bond reading ability, the way she could feel where true conflict lay versus where people were just posturing, cut through weeks of political maneuvering. Two previously hostile territories resubmitted their oaths after Ember visited personally. Riverbend first, then Western Shore, again this time, with full formal pledges instead of cautious neutrality. 40 wolves from Cassandra's former faction requested permission to return. They had followed Cassandra north out of loyalty, but loyalty frayed when it was met with bitterness instead of vision. Ember welcomed them back. No questions, no judgment. A pack is strongest when it's whole, she told Kieran. We don't turn away wolves who want to come home. General Ronan reported a 15% increase in combat drill effectiveness. The wolves trained better together under Ember's ambient bond amplification. Their coordination was tighter, their instincts sharper. She's making us stronger without even trying, Ronan told Kieran over evening strategy sessions. That's what a true Luna does. Kieran watched it all unfold, watched his kingdom stabilize, not through force but through connection. Watched Ember move through the fortress like gravity, pulling everything into alignment simply by existing. And slowly, so slowly, he almost didn't notice it happening, he learned to smile. Not often, but it happened. Usually it's something Ember said. Some observation delivered with her particular brand of quiet wisdom that cut through complexity and found the simple truth underneath. He delegated more, trusted his advisors where before he had hoarded control. And every morning at dawn, he walked the battlements with his mate hand in hand, watching the sun rise over their kingdom. 6 months later, spring came to Ironhaven. The mountain fortress that had spent winter looking like a clenched fist slowly opened its fingers. Green things pushed through cracks in the courtyard stone. The river below the eastern wall ran loud with snowmelt. The volume increased 30% from winter minimum. In the kitchen garden that Ember had planted in February, the first herbs shouldered their way into light. Basil and thyme and rosemary growing fast in the warming soil. Ember knelt in the dirt sleeves, rolled to her elbows, hair tied back with a strip of cloth. The locket hung forward from her throat, swinging gently as she worked. 6 months of steady meals and steady sleep had filled out the sharp angles of her frame. She had gained 25 pounds, all of it healthy weight, color in her cheeks, hands no longer raw. She looked less like a girl bracing for a blow and more like a woman standing in open air. Willa knelt beside her, 9 years old now. Her first shift had happened at the full moon in February, a cinnamon-colored wolf with oversized ears and boundless energy. She'd run straight to Ember afterward, trembling and elated and terrified all at once. Now she carefully transplanted basil seedlings with the exaggerated concentration of a child performing surgery. Like this? Willa asked, holding up a plant. Perfect, Ember said. Now press the soil around the base, gently like you're tucking it in. Willa obeyed, tongue poking out between her teeth in concentration. Ember, she said after a moment, do you wish you could shift? Ember considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Sometimes, but I think I was given a different kind of gift. Not a wolf that runs, she touched the locket, but a light that reaches. Willa nodded, wise beyond her years. Kieran appeared at the garden gate. He'd been in the training yard. Ember could tell from the damp at his collar and the particular way he carried himself after exertion. Loose-limbed, almost relaxed. Almost. The king was a work in progress, but the progress was real. He leaned against the gate and watched her. 6 months ago, he would have watched from a window, from a corridor, from behind the armor of distance. Now he stood in plain sight, and his gold eyes held something Ember had learned to name. Not just love, though it was that. Gratitude. The specific, luminous gratitude of someone who had been given a second chance they hadn't earned. Ronan wants to review the spring patrol routes, Kieran said. Then go review them. He wants your input, something about the southern perimeter. The wolves are shifting their denning patterns. He thinks your bond sense might explain why. Ember looked up, dirt on her hands, sunlight catching the crescent scar, the locket glowing faintly as it often did now. A constant, low pulse like a second heartbeat. Give me 10 minutes. Kieran nodded. He didn't leave immediately, just stood there watching his mate kneel in the dirt with a child beside her. and the expression on his face was the one Ember had seen for the first time on the parapet in the moonlight. The one that said, "I don't deserve this, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to." He turned to go, paused. Ember. The moon petal in your locket. Have you looked at it today? She hadn't. Ember unclasped the locket and opened it, and her breath caught. The pressed moon petal, paper-thin, translucent, carried for 19 years as the last relic of a dead woman's love had changed. From its center, a new shoot was emerging. Tiny, green, impossibly alive. A leaf no bigger than a fingernail unfurling toward the light. The flower that had been preserved in death was growing. Ember stared at it, vision blurring. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the locket and felt the warmth of the living thing inside it, and understood in a way that bypassed language entirely what it meant. Her mother's light had not died. It had been dormant, waiting as all seeds wait for the right conditions, for soil, for water, for someone patient enough to tend it. Ember closed the locket, pressed it to her lips, then to her heart. Across the garden, Kieran watched. He didn't ask what she'd seen. He didn't need to. The bond between them carried it. A pulse of joy so pure it made his wolf lift its head inside his chest and whine. Willa tugged Ember's sleeve. "Is it growing?" "Yes," Ember whispered. "It's growing." She set down her gardening tools, brushed the dirt from her hands, and as she stood, her hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen. Kieran saw it, went very still. "Ember." She looked at him, held his gaze across the garden, and nodded once. Pregnant, lunar heir. Child of moon and wolf. Future of both bloodlines. Kieran crossed the garden in 4 long strides, dropped to his knees in the dirt beside her, heedless of his clean clothes or the fact that Willa was watching with wide eyes. He placed both massive hands on her still flat stomach. "How long have you known?" His voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days. I wanted to be sure. A baby." The words came out awed, broken. "Our baby." "Our baby," Ember confirmed. For a long moment, Kieran didn't move, didn't breathe. His hands remained on her abdomen, warm and steady, and Ember watched something move across his face. Not shock he'd suspected the moment her hand moved, but realization. The enormity of it. A child. Their child. Half lunar, half alpha. A bridge between 2 bloodlines that had been enemies. A future neither of them had dared to imagine 6 months ago, when she'd stood on that altar in a too large gown and watched him kneel. "I thought," his voice broke, started again. "I thought I'd destroyed everything my father touched. Every bloodline he hunted. Every wolf he killed." "You didn't destroy," Ember said softly. "You're helping it grow." His eyes met hers, gold and silver, wolf and moon. "Thank you," he whispered. Not for the child, though that was part of it. For choosing him. For staying when he'd given her every reason to run. For teaching him that strength wasn't the same as walls, and that surrender could be the bravest thing a king ever did. He kissed her, tender and reverent, uncaring that they had an audience. Willa giggled, delighted. The bond flared, a pulse of warmth that every wolf within 200 feet felt in their bones. New life, new hope. The pack would know within the hour. The news would spread like wildfire through the fortress. The wolfless Luna, the impossible mate, was carrying the Alpha King's child. And the child would be lunar, an heir who could bridge both worlds, who could govern through light and strength in equal measure. Legacy secured. The spring sun climbed above Ironhaven's towers. In the courtyard, the gray wolf that had first lain at Ember's feet stretched in a patch of warmth content. In the kitchen, Bram sang while kneading bread, teaching his nephew and Willa's younger brother the rhythm. The sound of his voice carried through open windows. In the war chamber, Ronan spread his maps and waited with the patience of a man who had finally, after 40 years of service, seen his king find peace. In the infirmary, Azra and her healers tended wounded from a minor border skirmish. Recovery time still 25% faster, with Ember's presence in the fortress even when she wasn't physically in the room. The bond did that, strengthened everything it touched. In the lower keep, Magda gathered the elderly wolves in their common room, teaching the young ones old stories, passing down the history that the purges had tried to erase. In the training yard, soldiers drilled, their coordination tighter, their bond amplified by the Luna's resonance, humming through the fortress like a frequency they could feel but not hear. And in the garden, a woman with silver eyes and a crescent scar knelt in the dirt beside a child tending small green things into the light. The locket at her throat pulsed, soft, steady, alive, like a heart that had learned at last that it was safe to beat. That evening, as dusk fell over Ironhaven, Kieran and Ember climbed to the highest parapet, the place where she had first felt the lunar presence awaken, where he had told her the truth about what she was, where everything had changed. They stood at the edge, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on her abdomen, his hand covering hers. The full moon rose over the Montana mountains, massive and luminous, painting the world in silver. Below them, the pack began to howl. Not a war cry, not a challenge, a celebration. Ember closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Let the bond thread through it, weaving 5,000 voices into a single song. My mother told me something once, she said quietly. She said the moon doesn't argue with the darkness. It just keeps shining until the dark forgets it was ever there. Kieran pulled her closer. And now I understand. Ember opened her eyes, looked up at him. Love doesn't conquer darkness. It outlasts it, one quiet, persistent light at a time. He kissed the top of her head, said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. They stood together on the parapet as the moon climbed higher and the pack sang below and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Two people who had been broken, learning together how to be whole. A king who had found his mate, a Luna who had found her pack, and a child not yet born who would carry both their lights into the future. The wind carried the scent of spring, new growth, new life, and in Ember's locket pressed against her heart, the moon petal continued to grow. One small green leaf at a time, reaching toward the light.